Como decía el gran compañero Gustavo Cerati, el minuto, el segundo, el instante. Saludos amigos y amigas de Breaking News. Bien, con un episodio más, un capítulo más. Este que te habla Jorge Ramos Lugo. Arturo no está en Perú, pero estoy con Enrique Fernández. Y Enrique Fernández, ¿cómo estamos hoy? Cuéntamelo. Ya que Arturo no está, te toca a ti, bebé.
Estamos
Cuéntame.
en vivo, un poco menos de entusiasmo que como Arturo usualmente lo dice, porque ustedes saben que yo soy más low key,
Más low key.
pero estamos en vivo, estamos en vivo. Y estamos súper contentos por el invitado de hoy.
Estamos súper contentos, estamos pompeados. Y el episodio de hoy le pusimos como nombre Having a Beer with Mitch Steele. ¿Quién es Mitch Steele? El cofundador de New Realm Brewing Company. Además, una verdadera leyenda, un ícono. Además, escribió este libro, este magnífico libro de uno de nuestros estilos favoritos. Mira qué nombre dice ahí. Mira acá. ¿Qué nombre dice ahí? Mira, ¿qué nombre dice? No va a ser, que ya tú sabes, vamos. Aquí lo tenemos de invitado. How you doing, Mitch? Welcome to Breaking News, Brian Coffee. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Great to be here. Thank you.
It's an honor to have you here, Mitch. You've been one of our, on the really top of the list for our, potential invites, guests on the show. And it's finally great to have you. You're a legend in the industry, so I really appreciate your time and
thanks.
Taking a little bit of time to be here with us tonight. So the show's mostly gonna be focused on IPA because I mean, why not? It's our favorite style. I'm assuming it's your favorite style. Before we get into that, we usually like to get to know a little bit about background of our guest. As you know, a renowned expert in the brewing industry, how did you first step into how did you get started in the beer world?
Well, I was at the University of California at Davis in the early 1980s, and I landed into a winemaking class, and the winemaking class is what got me into the whole science and art of fermentation. And then a little while later, I found out they had a brewing program, brewing science program at University of California, Davis. So I was a beer drinker already at that time, and I just kind of went, boom, I'm in brewing science. And so I studied brewing science and fermentation science in college, and that's how I got my start. I didn't start brewing professionally till about 4 years after I got out of college. So, there weren't a lot of jobs back then, and not a lot of opportunities. But eventually, I got to where I wanted to be.
So,
I just realized we didn't pour our beers. We didn't say what we were gonna drink. So I'm gonna.
Yeah. What you are drinking?
I just poured myself a Nelson from Prison Pals, which by the way they just got a bronze at the World Beer Cup recently for this beer. So
I saw that.
Congrats to Prison and cheers. It's really nice hazy IPA. What are you guys having?
I forgot my beer, so I'm texting my wife right now and asking her to bring me a beer.
No problem.
I'm having a West Coast IPA from Boreal here in Nashville. So very nice.
Oh, cool.
7.2% alcohol. Really beautiful beer.
It's a nice.
Yeah, they make great beer, don't they?
Yeah.
Good choice.
You basically sort of fell into in college. You saw the brewing sciences, and that sparked I was like a calling.
Yes, it was. And one of the things that really cemented it or really made this the real deal in the brewing science, we took a field trip and went up to Sierra Nevada in Chico, and it had only been open a few years at that point. They were still brewing on a 10-barrel brew house, I think, and had open fermenters, and we're in there and we're watching Steve Dressler brew a batch of beer and taking a tour and tasting all these, these three wonderful beers. At the time, they had Pale Ale, they had Sierra Nevada Porter, and Sierra Nevada Stout. And the hop character was unlike anything I had ever tasted or smelled before. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do.
Wow.
Amazing. And such to be around such greatness. I mean, at that point, probably not a lot of fame in their names, but probably looking back now, you were like, holy, I was amongst some of the greats in the start of the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was inspiring back then, but looking back on it, it's like, wow, that was really, really something.
Mitch,
awesome.
When do you decide to open New Realm with brewing company, and what's some of the key factors and challenges you encounter establishing a growing successful brewery?
Oh my gosh, that's such a big question. So the original business plan for New Realm was not developed by me. There were two co-founders that I worked with that created the business plan and what they wanted to do, and then they approached me about joining them. And and they had kind of an interesting concept in that they wanted to build breweries that were, small regional breweries and build them in several states in the Southeast, and then distribute the beer in the states where we had breweries. And I thought that was an interesting concept because I thought the Southeast had plenty of room for more breweries. And I thought I liked the idea of not trying to go nationwide with our beers, because that was right at the time that a lot of the breweries, the craft breweries that had gone national, were really starting to struggle because there's so much good local beer. So we decided to focus on local, and I think that was really kind of a key thing. For me, I left Stone Brewing because honestly, a couple reasons. It was not because I wasn't happy. I was very happy at Stone, but this was an opportunity for me to start something from the ground up, and also move to the East Coast again, which my family really liked. So, I decided, at that point in my career, I'd kick myself if I didn't try. And and it's been tough. COVID certainly was a problem for us. We survived, obviously. We're still here, but that was a rough year and a half, 2 years. The Southeast is very different as far as its beer landscape than the West Coast. The West Coast, when I left the San Diego area, the West Coast was, almost essentially all India Pale Ale. With a few exceptions. And then, I come to Atlanta and I see all these different beer styles being brewed. And, one of the things that we did that we had to rethink very early on is we came out with a lot of really classic styles. We had a pale ale that was inspired by Sierra Nevada. We had a porter. We had a West Coast double IPA and a West Coast IPA. And none of those really worked with our guests in our tap room in Atlanta. The IPAs were too bitter for them. The porter and the pale ale weren't interesting for them. We thought they were great beers, but we had to kind of early on shift gears, and we started brewing a hazy IPA within 4 months of us being open. When it wasn't in the original plan to do that. So, we were reacting to what our customers were telling us, which was different than what we thought was going to work.
Going from, being the brewmaster at such a notorious and great and, legendary place as Stone Brewing, set up for years, and going from that to starting up from zero, was it a very big change in your daily work day, or was it you sort of just fell into it pretty comfortably?
No, it was a big change because we're a much smaller staff, and one of the things that I got to do at Stone was build a really great brewing team, maintenance team, engineering team. And we didn't have any of that when I started at New Realm. And so, we had to start from the bottom We hired some pretty good brewers to start with. A few are still with us. And we hired an engineer, which was the most important thing we did, trying to build a brewery and manage a construction project like our Atlanta brewery was, which was a huge project. It was crazy. And having an engineer, he was the most important person in the whole process, and I was very thankful that we had him. He was somebody that I actually worked with at Stone. We hired him when I was at Stone, and then he left Stone probably about 3 or 4 months after we started working on New Realm, and so we brought him on the team, and he did great. So anyway, yeah, that was that was one of those things that was like, okay, I'm a brewer. I know enough engineering stuff to be dangerous, but I need somebody who really knows what they're doing here as far as managing a construction team and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And once you get going, like they say, everything breaks at a brewery every day. There's usually, a ton of things going, equipment and stuff not going the way you planned it.
Yeah, it's always a lot of what we call firefighting, just trying to get around problems and fix things.
So going back towards the theme of the IPA.
Yeah.
For being like basically the most popular style in the entirety of craft beer nowadays, it's still, the history behind it is sort of, not everybody's on the same page. Could you give us like a brief, rundown of the history of the style?
Yeah. So it appears, we all heard the story, as we became beer fans about IPAs being invented to be shipped to India, and some crafty brewer in England decided to dry hop the beer to great levels, and then the beer would survive the shipment. And that's not really what happened. It appears, and this is all theoretical because the brewery that actually was first shipping this beer to India no longer exists, and none of the records really exist. But what most people think happened was in the late 1700s in England, pale ales were becoming very popular, and they had the brewers and maltsters in the UK had figured out how to kiln malt and not make it brown, which is what most malt was colored, how most malt was colored at that time. And so they started brewing these pale ales in the 1700s, and they were making pretty strong beers, 7, 8, 9% beers out of this pale malt. And this brewer, Hodgson at the Bow Brewery in London, worked out some sort of deal with the East India Company to ship beer over to India to the people, the folks from England, the colonists and the soldiers and such that were there. And one of the myths about India Pale Ale is that it's the only beer that really survived the voyage, and that's not true. There was a lot of porter shipped over to India as well, and Hodgson started shipping this pale ale, and it became very popular. And the whole thing with the East India Company is they were running ships back and forth to India, and they were bringing back a lot of stuff from India and selling it in England, but they weren't taking much over to India with them, and so they started taking beer, and then it turned into what it did. Now, that went on for probably 50 years, and Hodgson never called the beer India Pale Ale or IPA, anything like that. And so, the whole idea that this beer was invented and called India Pale Ale or IPA it doesn't ring true at this point. And after a few decades of shipping beer, there were breweries in Burton-on-Trent in England who decided, for various reasons, to get involved in the IPA trade or the pale ale trade, exporting to India. And so they started brewing the beer. And shortly after they started brewing, they somebody in the, in the sales, advertisements or whatever started calling it India Ale. And, that was like the 1820s or 1830s. And so, for a long time, there was no reference to this beer as being a beer specifically for India. It was just a pale ale that was on a boat. And, it was common practice for brewers at that time to dry hop the casks or barrels that the beer was stored in. So that was happening anyway. And the thing is, the beer got over to India and had cleared up and tasted really good. And so it became very popular. So that's kind of the origin story for India Pale Ale. And then, after that, when the Burton brewers started really brewing India Pale Ale, they made a lot of refinements to the beer to actually make it survive the trip better.
So the fact that they were adding this boatload of hops into the casks had nothing to do with keeping the beer fresher, basically.
It did, but it wasn't specifically invented for that trip. And so it was common practice for brewers all over the world to add hops to casks before they ship them. Yeah, so it's there were things that the Burton brewers did that really made the beer more suitable for shipping. But they did multi-stage fermentations of the beer. So the beer would go through a primary fermentation, and then it'd go into into casks or barrels. They use the word interchangeably. It would age in barrels for several seasons. The fermentation would restart. The beer was completely flat and dry by the time it got to, or was shipped to India, rather. And so it had gone through these multiple fermentations. As the beer warmed up in the warehouses, it'd start fermenting again. And that was a my wife just brought me a beer. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you to your wife.
So
what beer is that?
So this is a beer that we brewed earlier this year called Blacklight Bear, and it was only sold to one place in Virginia. But yeah, it's a pretty fun beer. It's got Centennial and Eldorado. It's pretty much a West Coast IPA with Centennial and Eldorado hops in it.
Nice color.
Cheers to your wife for bringing a mid-podcast beer.
Now I feel like
I don't know if you guys can hear me all right. They were saying my mic was
now it's perfect.
It's good.
So Mitch, what you're saying is these people in India weren't really having fresh IPAs. They were having actually pretty old IPAs by the time they got them then.
Yeah, there was a rule that the IPA that was shipped had to be at least a year old before it even got onto one of the boats. And so, So what was happening is these brewers in Burton would put the beer in a barrel, and then they'd ship the barrels to London or Liverpool or some other port city, and the beer would sit and age. And if you've ever gone to London and gone to the St. Pancras train station, the basement area in that big train station is where they used to store IPA, where Bass used to store IPA. And you can see these arched brick walls, and they put the barrels in the arches, and they're still there. But yeah, it went through, what they called a winter fermentation and then a summer fermentation. And, by the time the beer was actually ready to ship, it was flat, and they dry hopped it again, and they put it on a boat to India. And by the time it got to India, it was bubbly and clear. And if it shipped right, it was quite tasty. And they called the flavor peculiar and fine, and peculiar in a good way, I think. And, so there's a lot of talk about what was going on here. This beer had been completely fermented out in England before it shipped. There's no way it could be carbonated. Well, there's a couple theories that have come up in pretty strong theories, I think, since I published the book. The first one is that these casks that they use, these oak barrels they use in England, they would ship the pieces back to England and rebuild them and put beer in them again. And so there's a theory that these casks or pieces of wood were infected with Brettanomyces. And so Brettanomyces was doing this last final fermentation during the trip to India. And that makes a lot of sense, because researchers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when they really started getting into the science of yeast, discovered that most English yeast strains had 6 to 7 varieties of yeast in them. So, if you get a culture from a brewery and you isolate the different yeasts that are in there were 6 or 7 different yeasts in there, including Brettanomyces. So Brettanomyces was in these British breweries. There's no way around it. So it's certainly possible that this beer went through a Brettanomyces fermentation, which would make it taste something like an Orval in my mind, from Belgium. The other thing that has come up recently as a possible cause for the carbonation and the re-fermentation of this beer is hop creep. They were dry hopping the beer in the cask, and it's quite possible that just the oxygen getting into the cask when you go through that process, and the enzymes in the hop leaves themselves would actually reinvigorate the yeast and the enzymes would break down what was left of fermentable sugars or unfermentable sugars into fermentable sugars, and then the yeast would go active again. So two somewhat valid theories. I tend to lean more towards the Brettanomyces theory. I think really that's what it was. Just looking at the descriptions of the beer and, the flavor, the taste descriptions, and, very fine, very peculiar, champagne-like, those were all phrases used to describe India Pale Ale. And to me, that just screams Brettanomyces.
Wow. So they were having super, super dry beer, lighter colored than they were used to at that time. And that hits a bunch of notes, I guess, in the palates of awesome.
And the brewers in Burton wanted the beer extremely light in color, so they did a couple of things. Number one, they developed a kilning process, so the malt that they were using was the lightest colored malt you could find anywhere in the world in the early to mid 1800s, and in fact, that's how Pilsner started. Is that brewers from Europe went to England to learn how these brewers were making this really light colored malt, and they took that back to the Czech Republic, whatever it was called back then, and they developed the Pilsner from using a similar malting process. But the other thing that the brewers in England did is they boiled at a very low intensity in the brew house, where you go through the kettle boil, and today we're taught you got to get a vigorous boil. You got to get this really rocking boil so you extract everything out of the hops. Well, in Burton, they purposely made the kettles a little bit too small so that they couldn't do that. So the boil was more of just a simmer. And so they didn't develop a lot of color during the boil like brewers do here now. So I thought that was really fascinating.
Caramelization.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing how the whole thing just shapes the style to what we have. I mean, not exactly what we have now, obviously, but it's still, we're a long ways away from what we have now. But Mitch, after so many years of being, involved in this particular style, nowadays, like, how do you, when you develop an IPA recipe, what are the key factors you consider to achieve, a well-balanced, flavorful beer in your style, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think I've had to rethink that since I left Stone. At Stone, we did it a very certain way. We made our IPAs very bitter, very boldly flavored. I had to tone that back a little bit when I moved to Atlanta. Our first IPA was over 70 IBUs, and we just got complaints from people saying it was too bitter. And so now what I look for is somewhere in between 45 and 65 IBUs typically in an IPA. 45 being on the low end, that's more for like hazy IPAs, and then 65 if I'm doing something like this beer, which is more West Coast. And I still like to use a lot of hops in the Whirlpool and the dry hop. I still think you get a lot of flavor from that. And there's a lot of new hop varieties out there, so I'm having a lot of fun trying those new varieties in an India Pale Ale and a lot of different hopping techniques. It's just been, I wasn't sure we were ever going to do hazy IPAs, and I wasn't sure that hazy IPAs were going to last, honestly, because I had lived through so many IPA styles that came and went, like black IPA and white IPA,
brut
IPA, and all these things. And and there was part of me that was wondering whether hazy IPA was going to be another one of those. And certainly it isn't. But we had to learn how to brew hazy IPAs because I had never brewed one before. And so that took a while, and it was fascinating to see. At the time we started doing them, a lot of old school brewers were complaining that they were just lazy brewers making hazy IPAs, right? And that is so far from the truth. Those beers, those hazy IPAs are really innovative and really hard to make.
Yes.
Hard to make well. So, it was a great process, a learning process for me. And, for me with IPAs, I still feel like there's a ton to learn as far as hop combinations, yeast combinations, yeast types, things like that. And that's where I'm putting a lot of my focus right now.
Talking about hops, can you share some insights into hop selection and usage of when brewing an IPA of the hops?
Yeah. So typically I like to combine hops. I don't like to do single hop IPAs. I mean, I like them, but I feel the beer becomes more interesting if you have a few different varieties in the flavor and the dry hopping. So with a West Coast IPA, typically, I do a heavy Whirlpool hop. There's a study that was just put out by YCH Hops that talks about the flavors that are retained and which hop varieties have better flavor retention after fermentation than others. So, hops like Centennial and Cascade are really great. Equinaut, I think, was one of them that was really great. A hop like Azaka is not. All the flavors get volatilized and scrubbed out. So I've started looking at using those hops more in the Whirlpool. For a West Coast IPA or just a regular American IPA, dry hopping happens post-fermentation. And usually it's we use a total of about 2 pounds per barrel in the dry hop. And a lot of times I'll just split it evenly between 2 hops for the first batch. And then I may adjust the ratios depending on what the beer tastes like. Like this one, for instance, was 50-50 Eldorado and Centennial. And I think when we rebrew this one, which we're talking about doing right now, we'll probably drop the Eldorado and bump up the Centennial a little bit, just so that we make sure we get both the character of both hops in the beer. At Stone, we did a beer called Enjoy by whatever IPA, right? The one with a 35-day date code. That beer used 8 different hop varieties in the Whirlpool and dry hop. So and there was a reason for that. It allowed us to make substitutions without drastically changing the beer. Because we started off using some hops that we weren't sure we would be able to get in the future. And so we were very conservative by using a lot of different varieties, so that if we couldn't get Galaxy, for example, we could swap in something else and adjust things and keep the flavor the same. I don't do that much of that now. I tend to stick to 2 to 3 varieties of hops in a West Coast style IPA. New England or hazy IPAs, I approach it a little bit differently. We tend not to do a lot of bitter hopping in the boil. We might do a little bit of a late hop or just a little bit of kettle hopping just to keep the foam down. But most of the hops are being added to the whirlpool with the thinking that a lot of the flavor is going to be retained because it's not going through this intense boil. And then you still extract enough bitterness to make the beer balanced. And I'm targeting typically, 40 to 50 IBUs in a New England IPA, with a lot of whirlpool hopping. A mid-fermentation dry hop, in my mind, is critical for this style. You need the right yeast strain to biotransform the compounds in the hops and get that juicy orange juice character in the beer. And then we typically follow that up with what I would call a regular post-fermentation dry hops. And again, 2 pounds, maybe a little bit more than 2 pounds per barrel in the hazies, just because we want the haze and we want the intense hop character in there. So that's kind of where I'm at with IPA formulations these days. And I love trying different hop combinations and new hops. And, some of them work well and some of them don't work well. And it's been really interesting.
Which one is your favorite hop?
Oh my gosh. I think Centennial's probably has been my favorite hop for a long time. I do like Citra a lot, but Citra's amazing. But the problem with Citra is 30 to 45 days in a can. All the Citra is gone. It just drops. So, which is another reason why I don't like to do single hop beers, because you never know what's going to happen. And Citra tends to drop off very quickly. And that's why I like having other varieties when I use Citra. I love the flavor of Citra. Gosh, what else is out there now that's really exciting me? Hopsteiner has a new experimental hop called 17701 that we're having some fun with. I like Strata a lot. Strata, again, is a hop I would not recommend using as a single hop, but the hop farmers say it plays well with others, which I really like as a term. And I think that works great. And Strata is a really nice hop. It's got kind of a cannabis and a berry kind of character to it, which is a bit unique and can be pretty strong if it's the only hop in the dry hop.
Wow.
I've had a few recently I've had a few Citra Strata beers, which I think that combo works really well because all of them have been like above and beyond really good.
That sounds awesome.
Definitely. I think both of them were West Coast. One of them was forgot if it was North Park or the guys at Green Cheek, which they're all making amazing beers, actually I think
both those guys. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say both those all around. Awesome IPAs.
I'm going to go ahead and throw up a couple of questions from comments here quickly, since you were touching the subject of West Coast IPAs. Juan Paquita, a local home brewer, he makes really good beers. He says, Mitch, what's your go-to yeast for West Coast IPAs?
I like Cal Ale yeast. I think it's just a real clean, Chico yeast, whatever you want to call it. Every yeast supplier is making one and give it a different number, but I just think that is the quintessential West Coast IPA hop. At Stone, we did not use that. We used one that was a bit more like the Pacific Northwest ale hop or ale yeast. It was London Ale 2, I think, was people recommended, was pretty similar to Stone. But when I left Stone and joined New Realm, I wanted to use the Chico yeast because, my favorite IPAs on the West Coast, like you mentioned Green Cheek and North Park and Beechwood, that's what they were all using. And Vinny, that's what he uses too. And so I was like, yeah, I'm going to use this yeast. This is a great yeast. So that's my go-to yeast for West Coast IPA right now.
If it works for Vinny, it's probably great.
Yeah, you can't really come with a better recommendation, right?
Hay otra pregunta de Wallo.
We have a second one here. Here we go. Wallo Robles is the owner and brewer at a small local brewery here in Puerto Rico. He asks, what are your thoughts on hop extracts for Whirlpool and dry hop?
So I think it depends on the type of extract. I know there's some hop companies that have come out with pourable extracts, and there's one that's made specifically for Whirlpool hopping. I love that product. It is I haven't done a lot of this, but I have used the Incognito from Haas in the Whirlpool. And what amazes me about that product is, number one, it's quite simple to use. But number two, the flavors from the hops don't fade away. They just carry throughout the whole fermentation. And so you can really look at it maybe reducing your dry hop a bit if you want. And, we don't. But, you've got a lot more hop character in that beer before dry hopping than you do if you'd use pellets in the Whirlpool. So I'm at the point right now where I'm starting to really experiment with some of these. That was one that worked really well. I know there's some post-fermentation dry hop characters or dry hop products. We've played around with them a little bit. I like what they do, but they don't taste like a pellet hop to me. It's different. And so where I've landed with dry hopping with extracts and oils and things like that is to use a blend. Use the Type 90 pellets or cryo hops or something like that, and then additionally use some hop oil or some extract. Yeah, Spectrum, that's what it is. Thank you. And I think it works. It retains kind of a more traditional beer flavor by doing that than if you use 100% of something like Spectrum in the dry hop. But, and to be fair, I haven't really tried it 100% as a dry hop, except in a non-alcoholic beer. So that doesn't really play the same as a regular beer.
I've sort of noticed trying beers, at least the ones with Incognito, I feel like the beer is like way sweeter, the hop flavor. And yeah, I usually prefer a little bit more resiny, a little bit more like dankiness in my IPA. So I mean, I like them, but I feel like it's like overly sweet and sort of a bit of a fake sweeter hop flavor than like mixing both.
Well, it's kind of like what hops taste like in wort. I mean, it just tastes the same kind of, right? And so you get that intense fruitiness, but you're not getting the resiny aspects of the hop, and that's, I think they're great products, and I really am a fan of using them, but I also like to just stick with the Type 90 pellets and use some of those as well. And that way I get the best of both worlds.
Nice.
So use them more like, like the cherry on top, not necessarily rely on them all the way.
Yeah. We haven't gotten that far with our research yet to see if we could actually go full bore into them. It's something we've been wanting to look at for a while, and we've played around with it a little bit, but, to really do formal, what I would call research into this, we just haven't had the ability to do that yet.
Nice. Mitch, how do you approach balancing the malt profile in IPA to provide a solid backbone for the hop forward character?
So are you referring to like what kind of malts and things like that, or
the malt profile? How do you balancing?
Oh, okay. So it's such a personal thing. I like to go crazy with the hops, and I think the blending really helps. I like to have enough malt in the beer to balance out the hops. So, I will use a little bit of specialty malts in the IPAs, and that kind of helps mellow the hop intensity a bit. Water's important as well. If you use soft water, you're not going to get the same hop intensity that you're going to get with hard water and high sulfate water. All of that stuff goes into putting a beer together, and we do a lot of different things. But I like to limit the dry hop as a maximum to about 3 pounds per barrel. I don't like to go above that, because then I feel like I get this really vegetal and harsh hop character in the beer. So I've pretty much decided, 2 pounds per barrel is my norm. And then 3 pounds per barrel if it's a really special beer, or it's a really high alcohol beer that can carry that much hopping.
Yeah, it doesn't have the like a hot burn, like I
Yeah,
say,
I don't like that.
like I said, like a Freddy Krueger. Like
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't like that. That's not pleasant for me. So
No.
Since we were talking about these newer hop products, has there been any time where you've used any other like unconventional or non-traditional ingredient in an IPA to sort of pop or give a nice pop to the flavors of the hops? In any of the beers you made?
Yeah, I think the one thing that really worked when we went in that direction was using lemon verbena in an IPA. And if you've never smelled a lemon verbena leaf, it's incredibly lemony. It's just really, really intense lemon. And I thought, wow, this would be really fun to use with hops. And it worked really well. I know some people use coriander in like the whirlpool, because the coriander has a lot of that. I think it's geraniol, which is in a lot of hops, but that's the main compound that biotransforms during hazy IPA production. So, so that's interesting. I haven't really done much with that, but obviously the lemon verbena one really worked. And, we did a beer with IPA with honey. And sometimes if you get a really strongly flavored honey and use that, like maybe 10%, some of that floral character from the honey really, really interacts nicely with the hop flavors.
Wow.
Lemon verbena. I gotta
try it.
I gotta look that up and smell it. Yeah.
We have a distillery at New Realm that we started a few years ago, but our master distiller just came out with a gin that uses lemon verbena as one of his botanicals in it. And I absolutely love the gin. It's wonderful.
Awesome. You touched a little bit a couple of minutes ago about the yeast. You mentioned mid fermentation, hopping, etc. But the mix of yeast and IPA styles, particularly, including like these new stylized yeasts and whatever. How do you manage that interaction between the fermentation and the hop profile in the beer? And like, do you have any preference towards cleaner, more traditional style, or some of these new fruitier, juicier ways of fermenting?
I'm in a good position where I can try everything. We have a lot of like this beer, we brewed 20 barrels of it. And, so it's going to one account. We brewed it specially for them. This is my opportunity to play with some of those things and really learn how they work. And so that's how we've approached it. I mean, I don't know if I have, if I had a preference, if I had, one IPA to brew for the rest of my life, it'd be a West Coast single IPA. That's what I'd brew. But, we have the opportunity at New Realm to be doing all these different things. So we've tried various thiolized yeast strains, and, we've tried mash hopping with those and trying to get, the extra boost of thiol release and all that kind of stuff. We've done probably 15 to 20 different hazy IPAs in a few years. Our best-selling beer right now is a hazy IPA called Hazy Like a Fox. But we've tried different yeasts, different hops, different hop combinations, different processing techniques, mid-fermentation dry hop at 24 hours, dry hopping in the fermenter before you even put wort into it, and then getting 100% contact time with those hops. We've tried dry hopping towards the end of fermentation. It's just fascinating to see how it works and how the flavors are different. And I do think that if you're doing a hazy IPA, for us, what's worked best is dry hopping, doing that mid-fermentation dry hop 24 hours after the fermentation after you filled the fermenter. And that way you've got a lot of yeast growth going on. You've got a whole bunch of yeast. You're at what they call high Kreuzen. Your yeast is very active, and it just attacks those compounds from the hops really fast.
So, talking about the water chemistry, what is the important of brewing an IPA? How important is the water?
So I never used to think it was all that important, and I think, researching the book and understanding the water chemistry in Burton-on-Trent, where they had sulfate levels like 400 or something outrageous, levels of sulfate, and having high calcium sulfate helps clarify the beer. It helps make everything settle out. So that's what they were trying to do with IPAs, was get the beer really clear and get everything to settle out of it. And having that water chemistry really helped. If I'm brewing a West Coast IPA, I like to have calcium and sulfate levels that are fairly high. At Stone, the water, it was Colorado River water that had traveled over 1,000 miles before it got to Southern California. Wow. And so it had picked up a lot of minerals in that travel through the Grand Canyon and everything else. And so the water sometimes would come in with 400 parts per million hardness, which is way too much to brew with and make a palatable beer. And so we were reverse osmosis treating that water and getting the hardness down to about 120 parts per million. And I want to say it had about 80 parts per million calcium and, maybe somewhere around 100 sulfate, but I may be wrong on that. But, when I got to New Realm, Atlanta water is very soft and it doesn't have a lot of mineral content. So we could start playing around with things. And we use the Brew and Water program, and we play around with water chemistry all the time. And certainly, with a hazy IPA, using calcium chloride as a mineral addition instead of calcium sulfate is going to give you a softer, more pillowy mouthfeel, and the hop bitterness is not going to be as pronounced. So the beer's more balanced tasting. And that was interesting to learn about. And really, to me, that was somewhat groundbreaking. Whoever figured that out, and maybe they just figured it out because that's the water they had, but whoever figured that out did something pretty significant for IPA brewers. And I think it's really fascinating.
So basically, look into everything, especially the water, before the actual hops that you're gonna put in it.
Yeah,
because
have a little.
You might end up with a terrible beer if it's not. I mean, you could have the best hops in the world, and if everything else is not on point, you're probably gonna screw up the IPA.
Yeah, it'll just be unbalanced, right? And we've talked a bunch about balance and balancing hop character, and I think the water for a long time was not really a big part of that process, but I think over the past 7-8 years it has become a very important part of the IPA recipe formulation.
We have another question here from Jose Rosa, local owner of a local distributor here in Puerto Rico. He actually distributes the prison beers here, and he's
nice.
Saludo, Jose. He's saying, "Hola, Mitch. What are your thoughts about the battle of new school West Coast IPA versus old school West Coast IPA?" I'm assuming he's referring to these super amber caramelly old school West Coast IPAs versus something like what the guys at Green Cheek or Slicer. I'm late. Maybe I'm late. Maybe you already talked about this. We haven't. By the way, love you, Mitch. He's mentioning the Steele this beer, I believe was the name of the beer that you brewed with Prison. That was a great beer. We had that. That one got to Puerto Rico. We were lucky to get that one. It's delicious.
That was so much fun. But it's interesting. The organizers of the Great American Beer Festival and the World Beer Cup just published new beer styles, and they've always had an American IPA category, and they built a new West Coast IPA category. And so to me, old school West Coast IPA would be like the IPAs I was drinking when I first started out, Celebration Ale from Sierra Nevada, Liberty Ale from Anchor, a bit of caramel malt in there, a bit of color, a bit of malt backbone. And then you get into, the stuff that we started doing at Stone and the brewers in Southern California have really mastered in this very, very pale color IPA with intense hop character. And honestly, I think I prefer that at this point in my life. I think I like the ultra pale, super hoppy, but balanced IPA. And part of it is that, if you are brewing with crystal malts and you're getting some color in the beer, as the beer ages in a can or a bottle, it tends to develop a lot of dried fruit character from those malts. And if you don't have those malts in the beer, it tends to age a little bit better, in my opinion. But to me, I've always, whenever I had a beer that was like yellow in color but had this amazing intense hop aromatic, I was a fan. And that is my kind of IPA right now.
Woohoo! Yeah.
That sounds delicious. That sounds sort of like a cold IPA.
Yeah, I like cold IPAs.
They're getting trendy, but, right? Yeah. I mean, I haven't had a bad one yet. At least I tried the OG cold IPA, Wayfinder, I believe, were the guys that came up with it. I had it in Denver last year, and it was amazing. Delicious. And I was like, my God, now I get it. I get what these people are trying to describe with these cold IPAs. So that was delicious, amazing. Next question.
15.
Right. Going back into dry hopping. What are a few techniques that you'd say, like, to avoid stuff like hop creep, potential, off flavors? You mentioned the vegetable flavors maybe developing if you leave it too long in the beer. What other maybe potential off flavors that a brewer could face? How could you deal with those in the dry hopping stages?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to do is minimize any sort of oxygen pickup during the dry hopping process. If you're just opening the door and throwing hops in, you're pulling in a bunch of air into your beer, which isn't great. I think one of the key things is not leaving the beer too long on the hops. That there's research that shows that hops impart everything they're going to impart in 24 hours. And so, and then once you get beyond that, you start pulling material and flavors from the leaves and stems and things like that. And I found that if you leave the beer on the hops for more than a week, you start picking up a lot of vegetal, leafy type character, which I don't particularly like in an IPA. So, what we do is we pull the hops off after 3 days of contact, and we bubble gas through the beer a couple of times to get the hops back up in the beer, and then we let them settle out, and then we drop them onto the floor after 3 days, and that seems to work pretty well. I think that's a good technique. Not letting your beer sit on your hops for an extended period of time. I also think, we've talked a lot about hop addition rates and just keeping that, not going overboard. Sometimes more isn't better. And you get to a point where, number one, you're not getting as much out of the hops as you would if you were using lower rates, but also you're picking up things that you may not want in the beer just because you've got this huge volume of green mass in the beer.
Does that go for all types of hops, or do you take into account the alpha acid content? Like, some can be in contact longer than others, or is that really not? It's gonna get rid of everything it's gonna give you in 24 hours regardless.
Yeah, I don't think that's variety dependent. I think that's just kind of a general rule with, and I don't know if the studies looked at more than one or two hop varieties, but I think right now the feeling is that's pretty much across the board with every hop variety.
Nice. Mitch, in your experience, what are some of the emerging trends or innovation in the craft beer industry that excite you you the most?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm really excited about is seeing all the breweries that are making lager beers right now. And I've always been a fan of like European lager styles, and craft breweries for whatever reason over the years never really. There were a few, but there weren't a lot of breweries making lagers. Everybody was focusing on English and Belgian styles for years, and the fact that you go to just about any brewery now, and they've got either a Pilsner or they've got a Kolsch, which technically isn't a lager, but certainly has a similar flavor profile. I really think that's neat. And, I think brewers branching out and trying different styles and providing more options is really good for craft beer. I think if everything is an IPA, people will quickly become kind of blasé or bored with it. And, and it's like, yeah, let's have some different styles here. And, I feel real fortunate at New Realm that we've gotten to do a lot of lagers. We've got a really nice Pilsner, and, we've got a Vienna lager, and we've got an American lager that has won a couple of medals. And, it's fun to be able to go out to the bar and either order an IPA or order one of those lagers and have that option, I think that's good for craft beer.
Is there any chance we might see some of your New Realm beers in Puerto Rico anytime soon?
We have a rule that we won't sell our beer in an area that we don't have a brewery on the ground. And that's part of the being local thing. So, I don't think so. I don't think so. But, I think we might be able to get them hopefully in the next few years into North Carolina. So, so we'll try to help you out there.
Yeah.
And then you could just ship them, right?
Of course.
Perfect. Sounds like a plan. I will be waiting for that care package.
So
awesome.
What is your upcoming projects, future plans, collaborations for New Realm?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty aggressive beer plan. We're doing a series of double IPAs that are music themed. We're just doing a cider right now, and we're trying to open a brewery in South Carolina in Greenville, which is not far from Charlotte. And then, we're looking at a few other locations to maybe build breweries and restaurants. Right?
Come on.
Yeah. I will tell you that North Carolina is probably the top of our list. We're in, Virginia and Georgia, and South Carolina, and then there's this big gap where North Carolina is, where we're not selling any beer. So we want to try and get there.
Need to rally.
Yeah, rally would be
fits into the puzzle nicely.
Yes, it does.
Well, maybe we got some breaking news on breaking news beer and coffee today. Who knows?
Yeah, it's I think. For us, we're branching out into a lot of different things. I mean, we've got a full-on spirits program. We've got the ciders. We've got ready to drink cocktails. And then, we did a American lager with a rock band last year called Blackberry Smoke Lager. Wow. Those kind of partnerships are really cool for us. They're a lot of fun. Everybody gets excited about them. So I'm hoping there's some more of that kind of thing going on for us.
Beautiful.
We can do a collaboration with Mitch in Puerto Rico.
That'd be awesome. A local brewery. Yeah, it'll be. If you're ever down in Puerto Rico, maybe we can hook something up. A local brewery with Mitch brewing. That'd be great. I'll sign me up for that. Official.
You know what? I am talking about being part of a cruise. An outlaw country cruise that Blackberry Smoke, the band that we partnered with, is playing on this cruise. and they want me to come on and talk about the beer. And I know one of their stops is Puerto Rico. So, so I will keep you posted.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to happen, but we'll see.
That sounds like it can have some great results. I'm sign me up for that.
That would be fun.
Mitch,
yeah.
Before we leave, we know you're a busy man. We really appreciate your time here. It's been fantastic sharing all this knowledge you have with us. What advice would you give to any aspiring homebrewer or just a person in general that maybe wants to go into the industry and get into it in these days?
I would say don't be afraid to experiment, try new things. That's how this whole industry was built on innovation. People tried things. They had things that were accidental that turned out really good. I mean, those stories are all over the place in craft beer. So you may not, you may put together a beer and think, oh my God, I totally screwed this up. Let the beer finish out and taste it before you make the call, because it may be one of the best things you've ever made in your life. And I think, not being afraid to make a mistake, not being afraid to, get out of the box or get out of the preconceptions that people have of what your beer should be. Try something different and just see if it works. And sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. But I tell you, when it works, it's the best thing in the world.
Wow, really nice.
Sounds like sound advice right there.
We have another Ricky Craft Beer saying something there.
Oh yeah, Ricky Craft Beer, a great friend of us here. He says we'll give you a tour for free when you're in Puerto Rico for sure.
Deal.
Definitely
Deal.
That happens. So, Anina's saying field trip. Oh yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, we'll figure it out.
So Mitch, can you tell us your social media, where we can find out from more information about New Realm, your social media?
Yeah, New Realm has internet and Instagram pages. Every one of our brewery has their own site, but it's, if you go to newrealmbrewing.com, you can hit our internet site, and from there you can get to all of our social media and all of our specific brewery sites, which have a lot of posts about our restaurants and the food that we're doing, as well as the beers and spirits and cocktails and things like that. So we're all over. And then I have a Instagram account and a Facebook account as well. And a lot of times, we're doing so many different things. A lot of times what I'm really excited about the beer doesn't make it to the New Realm socials, so I put it on my socials. So
also you play guitar, right?
I try. Yeah, no, I enjoy playing. I've been playing for about, 35 years or so. I'm pretty much self-taught. But I like playing music. It's kind of my release outside of beer. And it's fun to get together with people that like the same kinds of music and make music together.
If you can choose one artist and one beer, tell me.
Oh my gosh.
That's a toughie.
Oh my gosh, that's so hard. As far as a beer, I'm tempted to say Orval, but I think just from a drinkability standpoint, I think what I would choose is Blind Pig IPA from Russian River.
Wow. Amazing.
Man, that's a solid choice. Can't argue with that.
Music, oh my gosh. I just went and saw Dead and Company 2 nights ago. That was amazing. But I think I'm kind of old school. My parents introduced me to music in the mid 1960s when I was a small kid. The Beatles.
Wow.
Can't go wrong with the Beatles. So
damn, Blind Pig and the Beatles. I could easily go for those two any day of the week.
Perfect combination.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
Awesome.
Yes,
for sure. Love it, Mitch.
So
appreciate the time so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right, our social media important.
Quique, your social media, Quique.
You can me pueden encontrar en la esquinita del Jardín Cervecero. Estoy allí toda la semana. Sus necesidades cervecísticas tratamos de cubrirlas siempre allí, así es que si van para allá me buscan y nos damos una beer. Y Enrique Fernández en Facebook, Instagram, etcétera, si me quieren buscar en mis páginas personales. Zumba, Jorge.
Pues a mí me consiguen en Facebook bajo Jorge K. Ramos Lugo, en Instagram bajo Ramones Brew, y en todas las plataformas nos consiguen en YouTube, nos consiguen en Spotify, nos consiguen en Facebook bajo Breaking News Beer and Coffee. Mitch Steele, it was an honor to have you in our podcast. This was a pleasure to have you here with us. Amazing conversation, amazing.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking with you both, and you know, and your friends, and yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you. Bueno,
Thank
amigos,
you so much. Really appreciate it.
So much. Bueno, amigos y amigas, será hasta la próxima aquí en Breaking News, Beer and Coffee. Como decía mi abuela, salud y pesetas. Ay, llévatelo, Quique, que va a estar el director.